Hello, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to the week 4 video lecture for Survey of British and American Literature. I hope you all had a restful Chuseok break, and this week I'd like to continue with our readings in British literature and just give you a little bit of context and the discussion questions for our second reading. The Model Millionaire by Oscar Wilde. All right, so we're going to jump ahead about 150, 200 years here. I hope the first reading was interesting for you, even if you didn't exactly enjoy it. I did try to find something that was fairly readable. I know some of you did say that it was somewhat difficult. But trust me that compared to a lot of the other writings of that time and before, that reading was one of the easier ones I could find. For this week, I think you'll probably notice a difference. Again, we're jumping ahead 150 plus years, so it should be a little bit easier for you. And I've kept it to only a 4-page story as well. So hopefully it's not too much of a burden and we can still find enjoyment and interest in this story as well. So the story is The Model Millionaire. It's written in published in 1887 originally. And it was written by one of the more famous British authors, and that is Oscar Wilde. All right. Actually, I should note that he is Irish. He was born in Dublin, but he's born to an English family, so he's kind of Anglo-Irish. I hope I don't upset any Irish people by including him in British literature. They are, again, remember, separate countries here as well. And they do have a very politicized history and future ahead of them as well. So let's talk a little bit about Oscar Wilde in the first part of this video. And then I'll get to the discussion questions that I hope that you will be actively participating in this week. All right, and again, just to remind you of our typical kind of schedule, I would like to begin with a video that just gives a little bit of context. I don't want to overwhelm you with too much history about the author and the period and their style, but I do want to open some doors and windows into understanding the literature that we're reading as well. But what's most important here is that you do the reading and try to engage with it. And I'm really just trying to help you to engage or find a relationship with that literature. And I think the discussion part I really enjoyed with our first writing, and hopefully we can continue that, and that will really help us to build an engagement with this literature. So let's talk a little bit about Oscar Wilde's life and a few aspects that perhaps can bring you a little bit more into his work, specifically this work, The Model Millionaire. All right, as I said, he was Irish, born of English ancestry, and born in Dublin. His parents were very successful people. His mother was quite a character and had a large personality. I think a lot of that really got passed down onto him. He is famous for having a large personality, a very charming, witty, funny person. And a lot of that, I think, comes from his mother, who was a published author of poetry in her time, and even her husband, Oscar Wilde's father. He was a successful doctor who also wrote many medical books as well in his time. So again, he comes from a pretty wealthy family, and he did receive a great education, and of course he was a fairly good student, a good scholar as well. So he comes from a very successful background and received an excellent education. Um, as I said, he is kind of remembered as being extremely funny, witty, charming, intellectual man who was really popular in his time, not only for his artistic works, but as being a social person. He's very popular among the parties. He was one of the cool people in his time in living in England and in Europe largely. He was the person you would want at your party to be entertaining. Okay, he was quite a character in his time. Of course, we do remember him for his works. He is considered a great writer of, well, he was a journalist as well as a writer of short stories and prose, novels. The Picture of Dorian Gray. He's also a famous playwright, right? The Importance of Being Earnest, Salome. Okay, a famous playwright as well. So he was successful in basically everything he did, and considered a genius in his writings by many. All right. So let's talk a little bit more about his character. As I said, he was this really charming, intelligent socialite. He was famous for his fashion, and he's really kind of the main person you would point to if you want to define what a dandy is. D-A-N-D-Y. Okay, that word has existed for a while, but it's really associated with this period of time and also with Oscar Wilde. I know I've heard that word in Korea as well. Not so much these days, a little bit when I first came to Korea, maybe 15 years ago, 16 years ago. I used to hear it more commonly as a Konglish to describe a fashionable young man, a dandy. And that in Oscar Wilde's time was kind of the same usage of that word. A dandy is really just someone who pays close attention to their appearance, but their appearance, they want to get attention. Okay, so they're not dressing in classic subtle styles. They're really trying to get people to pay attention to them with lavish, outlandish kind of dress. Okay, just trying to get attention. It's not subtle in that way. But we should also note that in modern English, the English we use now, dandy is also a pejorative or a bad word. It has the other meaning of being a homosexual as well. And that's important to know, as it is important to know that Oscar Wilde himself was famously homosexual, and that was quite influential in his history, as I'll get to. All right, but this idea of dandyism or being a dandy, it is also part of what defines his kind of artistic philosophy as well. And that's really what I want to draw our attention to in thinking about Oscar Wilde, and perhaps applying to his style of writing, and if we can see it in this writing here as well. It can raise some important questions and discussion. All right, so dandyism is again part of his artistic philosophy. Like I said, being a dandy means to bring attention to the way you look. the way you dress, your fashion. Okay, it's not quiet, subtle, classic fashion. No, it's out there. It's loud. It draws attention to itself. All right, and dandyism is included in the definition of aestheticism. Okay, uh, aesthete or an aesthete or aestheticism is the kind of study of beauty or the idea of beauty. Okay, and this is a movement, an artistic or cultural movement that really comes in Europe in the 1800s or 1860, and then it kind of peaks with Oscar Wilde in the late 1800s, around 1880. Okay, and the story again written 1887. That was at the height of Oscar Wilde's popularity, the 1880s. All right, so a little bit about aestheticism. Okay, like I said, Oscar Wilde is a dandy. Dandyism is a part of aestheticism, and aestheticism is kind of a movement, a cultural or artistic movement focused on defining beauty. And one of the, if not the most commonly associated definition of aestheticism. What is aestheticism? It is the belief in art for art's sake. L'art pour l'art, okay, in French. Art for art's sake. And that basically means that the purpose of art is that it has no purpose other than to define beauty. All right. So, for example, if you think art must have some moral component, or it has to take into account politics, or you need to understand history through art, or art through history, the aesthetes, or people who believe in aestheticism, would say no. Art is about art. The purpose of art is to define beauty. Okay, that's kind of a simplistic definition, but that's it. Art for art's sake. All right. Now, aestheticism, I said, kind of came into a movement in the 1860s and peaked around the 1880s. All right. In British literature, this is what's called the Victorian era, or the Victorian age, after Queen Victoria. All right, and aestheticism is kind of the end of the Victorian period. It bridges the Victorian period to the modernist period. Okay, the modernist period, most people say, most scholars will say, begins around the late 1890s up to maybe 1900 or 1905. It depends on exactly who you ask or how you want to define it. But there's no perfect definition. Okay, movements kind of grow and then fade, and then other movements come in. So the Victorian age is ending with the aesthetic movement, and then after the Victorian age we get the modernist period. Okay, so this aesthetic movement, of which Oscar Wilde is one of the most famous characters, especially as a writer. He kind of is that bridge, and when he kind of dies, that really kind of marks the end of the Victorian era and the end of and the kind of beginning of the modernist period as well. So this it's interesting to kind of consider that, because aestheticism is often defined with the term decadence. Okay, to be decadent. All right, now decadence, if you want to define that term, and it's one that we'll see throughout history, decadence is kind of defined as a decline in the morality and values of a society. All right, so again, we see the end of the Victorian era, and this aestheticism is defined by its decadence. All right, But we see this idea of decadence often when we talk about the decline or the fall of the Roman Empire. To a certain extent, the Greeks as well, but the Roman Empire, we hear, society became so decadent. There's a decline in morality, all right, and values. We even, to this day, many critics of the United States as a superpower or an empire, which I think might be a fair criticism, they will use the term decadence. America has become too decadent. It's no longer a good Christian nation full of wonderful liberal values. Okay, whether you believe in the idea of decadence or not, these are very common criticisms of the downfall of Roman culture, right, in popular history, and perhaps in American history as well. All right, so this is also being applied to the fall of the British Empire. Now, again, when it comes to a certain day, like when did the British Empire die? We can't exactly say it was on this day. Some people will try to, but it is around this time, the end of the Victorian era, the end of the 1800s, the beginning of the 1900s, that we see the kind of the end or the death of the British Empire, the fall of the British Empire. All right. So some people, again, attribute that to decadence. Okay, when an empire or society gets so high, it turns in on itself. All right, and it doesn't. Let's see. Maybe we can explain this in more popular ways. If anybody's seen, what's that Jennifer Lawrence movie? The Hunter. I'm sorry, I should have remembered this name. Anyway, popular movie, Jennifer Lawrence. You see that in that movie, she's the huntress with the archer and the bow and arrow, and she's that society is full of these poor people, and they have to play the hunting game. I can't remember. I'm sorry. And you see how the rich people are living there. Those are examples of dandyism and decadence. Okay, so that movie is using a lot of the similar kind of imagery and symbolism and themes that people have used to describe the Roman Empire. People are using that to criticize the American Empire or culture now. That was the same kind of thing that was being applied at the time that Oscar Wilde was writing. And Oscar Wilde and the other aesthetics, rather than being criticized as being decadent, they took it as a term of pride. They would wear their dandy clothes proudly. They would behave in decadent ways. All right, so again, writers and artists like Wilde would kind of wear this term with pride, and they were reacting against Victorian society, which is largely remembered as being very strict and moral. Okay, so they were reacting into that very conservative society, and they were focused on beauty, right? A decadent view of beauty. They would see their writing, their poetry, their plays, their sculpture, their painting as not needing to be moral or virtuous. It doesn't have to give you a lesson. It doesn't have to teach you anything. You just have to enjoy the sensual beauty of it. And they would also live their lives in this way. All right, so they love to party, they love to wear fashionable clothes, they love to drink, they would do drugs, and also their sexual behavior was what they would consider at the time perverted. meaning they were just experiencing and shifting and challenging um, the norms, okay, what is considered normal values of that society, which was conservative of that time, right? At least that's how it's remembered, okay? So if you keep in mind Oscar Wilde, he was a homosexual, he was a dandy, he was also a proud man who was not shy, all right? He was living his life out loud. He was not trying to hide any of his philosophies. Okay? He lived his artistic philosophy as much as he wrote it. Okay, and that's very important for understanding who he is as well, because this lavish, outwardly lifestyle, his own kind of pride in living this kind of expressive lifestyle, it really led to kind of his death in the end. In his time, homosexuality was against the law, and just there's a long story to this. I encourage you to read up if you're interested in more in the history of it. But he was sent to prison for 2 years in 1895 to 1897 for being a homosexual, which was against the law in his time. And it was a very difficult time, obviously, being sent to prison for him. It was very different from the lifestyle that he'd grown up in, because he was, rich and privileged, and had enjoyed great successes. So he had to do hard time in prison, and he was suicidal probably for the first year that he was in prison, but he managed to finally get through his prison years. But the hard time had a very negative effect on his health as well, and it's debated exactly what caused his death, but a lot of people connect it to an ear problem that he suffered when he fell in prison. And he died 3 years after coming out of prison in 1900, okay, at the age of 46. All right, so there's just a couple connections there I wanted to draw your attention to. All right. Again, we're talking about Victorian era, right? The end of the British Empire. And then we're talking about Oscar Wilde, who is an aesthetic, all right? A decadent aesthetic, whose philosophy was to focus on art for art's sake, right? He didn't want the natural, simple aspects of beauty. It was kind of a rejection of other writers and culture of the Romantic period. His focus is more on sophistication and affectation. It's focused on the artificial. All right, like I said, even just his fashion. Think about that. It's not simple, traditional, classic look. He's trying to get your attention, and you can see that in his work. The philosophy of the themes that you might take to read his work, and even in his style, he pays a lot of attention to his style. Like I said, he's funny, intellectual, witty. Right? There's a lot of puns at play in his work. He's a famous humorist. He likes wordplay and draws attention to his use of words quite a lot. Okay, very witty in that way, and you can pick that up definitely in this writing as well. I'm curious about you as non-native speakers, picking up on some of those aspects of style and humor and wordplay. So I'm curious what you'll have to say about that in the discussion as well. But again, pay attention to perhaps the decline of moral values, the definition of art and beauty, and perhaps what, if anything, you might think Oscar Wilde has to say in this short story, The Model Millionaire. Now, to me, I just want to maybe raise some attention here because it does seem like a very simple fairy tale, one with a fairly straightforward moral if you read it that way. And you can, definitely. It's fairly easy read. I don't think there's a lot of mystery to what he's saying. But I think you want to also pay close attention to perhaps what else could be read into this story as well, keeping in mind the idea of aestheticism and decadence and who Oscar Wilde was. All right. So here are the discussion questions. Let me explain them a little bit better for you. You will, of course, have the discussion questions. I'll post them in a note form for you this week. And we will follow the same procedures that we did for the last writing. Again, I want you to hopefully, make your own notes, answer all of these questions, and I encourage you to write your answers. It's a better way of thinking through your discussion. And make sure you are required that you post any two of your answers. You can do more if you'd like, but any two of your answers to the discussion board on Kakao, and make sure that you respond to, at least, minimum, any two of your classmates' responses. And hopefully we can stimulate an interesting discussion, just like we did with our first writing by Defoe. And remember, any of your own questions, your own unique ideas are welcome and encouraged in our discussion as well. The discussion questions that I give you, I hope, are stimulating and encourage you and give you different directions to examine this work. But remember, in trying to best answer these questions, you should try to bring attention to the text itself. Explain your answers as clearly and logically and rationally as you can, and give evidence where you can as well. All right, those are going to make for better, more interesting answers. All right, so here are the discussion questions for The Model Millionaire by Oscar Wilde. Okay, as always, briefly summarize the story in your own words in English. Number 2, taken from the beginning of the story, a quote. Oscar Wilde writes, "Romance is the privilege of the rich, not the profession of the unemployed. The poor should be practical and prosaic." Okay, what does this mean to you, this quote that I've given you? What does it mean to you, and do you agree with it? Okay, so first of all, can you just understand exactly what he's writing here? And do you agree with it? What does it mean to you? All right, how do you react to that? Say, yes, he's right, or yes, he's right, but he's joking, and I don't believe what he's saying in this story. Or maybe you disagree with it on a certain level. Whatever your answer might be, I'm curious, and I'm sure your classmates are, to hear your opinions with some evidence. All right, number 3, directly after that quote, it is written, "It is better to have a permanent income than to be fascinating." All right, so I'm curious here, I've written it simply in a question. Would you, dear reader, rather be rich and boring or poor and interesting? Okay, let's get to the heart of the values that might be included in this story. All right, number 4. What does Oscar Wilde have to say about marriage and or social class? Okay, basically the story is about young man who wants to get married, but he's too poor. Okay, so here you can discuss, you can focus on marriage singularly, or you can focus on class. Okay, upper class, rich, middle class, working class, or the poor. You can focus on them individually, or you can consider, how marriage and class kind of work together as well. You can consider it in the time that Wilde was writing, or you can consider it historically. You can consider it now in our day and age, in our societies, or you can kind of separate the two, just between marriage and class, or class and marriage. Okay? All right, number 5, going back to aestheticism. Okay, remember, aestheticism is defined by a belief in art for art's sake. Art exists only for its own definition of its intrinsic beauty. Okay, it doesn't need to teach us anything. It doesn't need to be political or moralistic or serve any other purpose than to be beautiful in its own way. Okay, so do you think that this story supports that belief? Why or why not? All right. Number 6, what is the tone of this story? Okay, what do you think from the narrator? What is the way it's given? Okay, how would you describe the tone of this story, and how does Wilde establish that tone? Number 7, can you find any humor in the story, and can you give examples? Question number 8, characterize Hughie Erskine. Okay, that is the protagonist or the hero of our story. Tell us what kind of person Hughie Erskine is. Characterize him. All right, number 9, this is more of kind of trying to get your broader understanding about what this story is about, which I think is very helpful to do with any kind of reading that you're doing. So what are the possible themes to the story? What is the main idea of the story, or possible main ideas? There might be various ones that you can consider. And maybe more specifically, what is the dominant theme for you in your reading? Okay, and again, if you have an idea about the dominant theme, make sure you do your best to explain that as clearly as you can, and try to provide some kind of evidence by maybe tying it to something in the text, or the characters, or the plot, or imagery, or symbolism, to help explain your belief. Okay? And again, as always, feel free to ask your own questions to your classmates. If you have interesting discussion questions of your own, please add them to our discussion. And let's try to develop our own thoughts and develop the thoughts of each other by politely encouraging and challenging and exploring this text together. Okay? So I look forward to reading your responses and answering your questions, just like we did for our first work. So make sure you get the reading done if you haven't done that, and respond to these over the next week in our chat room. All right, and of course, if you have any other concerns or questions, you can ask me directly in the chat room, or again, email me. I'll try to get back to you as soon as possible. Take care, everybody. I'll see you later.